The blizzard came without warning across the high mountain passes where civilization ended and the wilderness began in earnest. Jake Morrison had been riding these slopes for 23 years, ever since he was old enough to sit a horse without falling off, and he had learned to read the sky the way other men read newspapers. He knew the signs. He knew the color that meant snow was coming. He knew the particular quality of wind that preceded a storm. He knew the way the air changed, becoming heavier, colder, charged with something that made every animal on the mountain nervous and restless. But this storm came different. This storm came fast, rolling down from the peaks like something alive and hungry, consuming the world as it advanced. One moment the afternoon was gray but manageable. The next, visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and the temperature plummeted so fast that frost began forming on Jake's beard within minutes. He had been heading down from the high pasture where he kept his winter cattle, checking on them before the season turned serious. He did this every year at this time, made sure they had enough feed, that the water sources weren't freezing over completely, that everything was as prepared as it could be for the months ahead. It was necessary work, important work, the kind of work that kept a man alive out here where the mountains didn't care about your plans or your timelines. The kind of work that demanded respect and attention and a healthy understanding of how quickly things could go wrong. Jake pulled his horse to a stop and turned it in a slow circle, trying to get his bearings. The trail he had been following was already disappearing under fresh snow. The landmarks he used to navigate, the distinctive rock formations and twisted pine trees that marked the way down, were fading into whiteness. The wind was picking up too, carrying snow horizontally now, stinging his face even through the thick scarf he had wrapped around his lower face. His horse was getting nervous. Jake could feel it in the way the animal kept shifting its weight, the way its ears kept swiveling back and forth, tracking sounds that Jake couldn't hear. Animals knew. They always knew when danger was coming. They had senses that picked up on the things humans had learned to ignore or override. Jake had learned long ago to listen to what his horse was telling him. It had saved his life more than once. He could keep going down. The cabin was maybe another hour away if conditions were normal, maybe 2 hours in this kind of weather, assuming he didn't get turned around and lose the trail completely. Staying out in this would be suicide. The temperature was dropping fast. The snow was accumulating on his coat and hat in thick layers. His horse would tire eventually, and when it did, they would both be stranded out here with darkness coming on. Death would follow within hours. That was how it worked in these mountains. You didn't get second chances. You didn't get rescue teams showing up with hot coffee and blankets. You made good decisions or you died. Sometimes you made good decisions and died anyway, but that was the risk you took when you chose to live this far from everything else. Jake was about to urge his horse forward when he heard something that didn't belong. It was almost impossible to hear over the wind, almost lost beneath the roar of the storm, but it was there. A sound like a voice, or maybe just the wind making sounds that almost seemed like words. Jake pulled hard on the reins and turned his horse toward the sound. He knew better than to trust sounds in a storm. Wind could trick you, make you hear things that weren't there, lead you off a cliff or into a ravine while you were chasing echoes. But something in the quality of that sound made him believe it was real. Something in the way it cut through the wind made him think it was human. He clicked his tongue and urged the horse forward, letting the animal pick its way slowly through the accumulating snow. The sound came again, more distinct this time. Definitely a voice, definitely human, definitely desperate. The horse found the figure before Jake's eyes did. The animal suddenly stopped short and began backing away nervously, snorting and shaking its head. Jake steadied it with a firm hand and squinted through the snow. There, on the ground, a shape that didn't belong, a person. Jake dismounted before he finished processing what he was seeing. The horse immediately began backing away further, not wanting any part of whatever this was, but Jake wrapped the reins around a nearby sapling and moved toward the figure in the snow. As he got closer, the shape resolved into details. A woman lying on her side in the snow. Her clothes were torn and soaked through. Her skin was already taking on that peculiar grayish quality that came with exposure. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were barely open, and they seemed to be looking at something very far away, the way eyes looked when the person wearing them was already halfway between worlds. She was dying, maybe already dead. Jake knelt beside her and checked for a pulse. There it was, thin and fluttering like a wounded bird, but there. She was alive. Barely. He needed to get her to shelter immediately. There was no time for questions. No time for understanding how she had gotten here or what she was doing on this remote mountain trail in the middle of a blizzard. There was only time for action. Jake picked her up and carried her back to the horse. She weighed less than he expected, fragile as something made of paper and wire. Her skin was ice cold even through his gloves. He held her against his chest with one arm while he mounted the horse with the other, a move that required strength and balance and an absolute refusal to consider failure. The horse didn't like it. The animal was spooked by her nearness, by the smell of her fear and desperation, by the wrongness of the situation. But Jake was firm, patient, and the horse eventually accepted the weight of them both and began moving forward. The trail down was barely visible now. Jake rode more by memory than by sight, letting the horse follow the path it had traveled hundreds of times before. The wind was worse now, possibly the worst he had ever experienced on this mountain. It carried snow and thick curtains that came and went in waves. It howled through the trees like something wounded and enraged. It tried to push them off balance, to knock them sideways into the darkness. Jake bent over the woman, shielding her as much as he could with his own body, and urged the horse onward. Time became strange. The ride might have taken 30 minutes. It might have taken 3 hours. Jake couldn't say. There was only the endless white, the wind, the cold, and the terrible awareness that the woman in his arms was dying with every passing moment. He could feel her breathing getting slower, shallower. He could feel her heartbeat getting fainter. He was losing her. The wind had other plans. About halfway down the mountain, a particularly violent gust caught them sideways. The horse stumbled, and for a moment Jake thought they were going over, that they would tumble down the slope and disappear into the whiteness. But the horse found its footing at the last possible second and kept going. Jake held the woman tighter and didn't look back. When the cabin finally appeared, materializing out of the white like something summoned from a dream, Jake nearly wept with relief. He had never been so happy to see that small structure in his life. The roof was covered in snow already. The windows were dark, but it was shelter, it was warmth, it was a chance. Jake brought the horse around to the side and dismounted awkwardly, still holding the woman, his balance thrown off by her weight and the cold that had made his muscles stiff. He stumbled toward the door, the horse following behind him with its nose nearly touching his shoulder. The door was heavy, made of thick wood and ironwork, designed to keep out the kind of weather that was happening right now. Jake shoved it open with his hip and stepped inside, pulling the woman with him. The cold followed them in, trying to wrap itself around everything, but Jake kicked the door closed behind them, and the wind was cut off as suddenly as if someone had turned off a switch. The sudden silence was almost painful. Jake stood there for a moment, breathing hard, his lungs burning from the cold, his arms aching from holding the woman. Then he moved. He had emergency supplies in the cabin, things he kept stocked for exactly these kinds of situations. Blankets, a first aid kit, a stove that could be fired up quickly, dry clothes, food. Everything a person might need to survive being pulled back from the edge of death. He laid the woman on the wide bed in the corner of the main room and began working with practiced efficiency. He peeled away her soaked outer clothing, careful and methodical, trying not to think about how cold her skin was, how still she had become. He wrapped her in every blanket he had, leaving only her face exposed. He got the stove going, feeding it wood, building up the heat until the cabin became warm enough that he could see his breath becoming less visible. He heated water and brought it near her, the steam rising up to help warm her from the inside out through her lungs. He did everything he knew how to do, everything the mountain had taught him about keeping people alive, when death was standing in the corner waiting to see if he would slip up. Then there was nothing left to do but wait. Jake sat in a chair beside the bed and watched her breathe. She was so still, so pale. Her lips were still blue, her fingers still purple with cold, but she was breathing. The heartbeat was still there, still fluttering like that wounded bird, but it was there. Jake had done what he could. Now it was up to her. Now it was up to whatever force governed these things, if there was such a force. Jake had stopped believing in God somewhere around the time his mother died when he was 17. He had been working toward it for years before that, accumulating evidence of a universe that was fundamentally unconcerned with human suffering, and her death had been the final piece of the puzzle. But sitting there in the cabin, watching this stranger breathe, watching her chest rise and fall in the firelight, he found himself praying anyway. He prayed to something, a habit maybe, a hope he didn't know he still had. Just let her live, he said to the darkness. Just let her make it through the night. The night was long. Jake didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every few minutes he would check her pulse, would feel for the rise and fall of her breathing, would adjust the blankets to make sure her core temperature was staying stable. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her eyes opening sometimes without seeing anything, her lips moving without forming words. He wondered who she was, how she had gotten out there in the middle of a blizzard on a remote mountain trail. There weren't any towns nearby. There weren't any roads. This wasn't a place people passed through. It was a place you went if you were trying to go somewhere specific or if you were trying to hide. The thought made Jake uncomfortable. He pushed it away and focused on the immediate task of keeping her alive. Somewhere around midnight, her eyes opened and she looked directly at him. For a moment she seemed to be present, actually seeing him, actually aware of where she was. Her lips moved and he leaned in close to hear. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're safe," Jake said, and it wasn't a lie, not exactly. She was as safe as she could be, given the circumstances. "Blizzard got you. I found you on the trail. You're in my cabin now. You're warm. You're going to be okay." She seemed to consider this information with great effort, as if processing words was like pushing a boulder uphill. Then her eyes closed and she sank back into unconsciousness. Jake sat back in his chair and waited for morning. When dawn finally came, the storm had passed. It had left behind a world transformed. Everything was white and clean and absolutely silent. The snow was so thick in some places that it had buried the smaller trees completely. The sky above was clear and blue and painfully bright. Jake stepped out onto the porch and surveyed the damage, assessing the state of the world. The trail was completely impassable. The power lines were down. The bridge across the creek was probably out. No help would be coming down from the higher elevations. No one would be coming up from the town either. They were isolated. He and the stranger were isolated, cut off from everything else, dependent entirely on each other until the weather cleared and the trail could be cleared. Jake went back inside and checked on her. She was still breathing. Her color had improved slightly, moved from that terrible grayish blue to something slightly more pink, though still far too pale. Her body had stopped shaking, which meant her core temperature had stabilized, which was good. She had made it through the night. The immediate danger had passed. Now came the longer process of recovery, the slow restoration of someone who had been pulled back from the edge of death. Jake made coffee and something to eat and sat beside the bed, waiting for her to wake up again. It took most of the morning. When she finally came to properly, her eyes were clearer, more focused. They moved around the cabin, trying to make sense of her surroundings. Then they landed on Jake and stayed there. He saw the moment confusion crossed her face, followed by fear, followed by an attempt at calculation. He had seen that sequence before, the way people's minds worked when they woke up in an unfamiliar place with no memory of how they got there. What if he was dangerous? What if she couldn't trust him? What if this was all a mistake? Jake kept his voice low and calm. "You're safe," he said again. "I found you in the blizzard yesterday. You were nearly frozen to death. I brought you here." She stared at him, trying to decide if she believed him. Jake could see the war happening behind her eyes. The part of her that wanted to trust him fighting the part that knew better than to trust strangers. "I'm Jake Morrison. This is my cabin. We're up on the mountain. The blizzard came in fast and hard. You were out on the trail somewhere and I found you. That's all there is." She tried to sit up and immediately fell back with a gasp. Her whole body seemed to be in pain, muscles protesting against movement they weren't ready for. Jake stood. "Don't try to move yet. Your body's been through something serious. You're going to be sore and weak for a while. You need rest, food and water when you can manage it. Time. What's your name?" She seemed to be thinking about whether to answer that question. Her face was a study in internal conflict. Finally, she said, "Emma." It came out as barely a whisper. "Well, Emma, you're lucky to be alive. Another hour out there and you would have been dead. Another hour and I wouldn't have been able to bring you back." Jake poured water into a cup and brought it to her, helping her sit up enough to drink. She managed a few sips before falling back again, exhausted by even that small effort. She drifted off and Jake returned to his chair. He sat there and thought about questions that needed answers but which he couldn't ask yet. Who was she? What was she doing out on a remote mountain trail during a blizzard? Where had she been going? Where had she come from? The clothes she had been wearing were torn and muddy, but they were quality clothes. Well made, expensive, the kind of clothes that suggested someone with means. Someone who didn't belong out here in the wilderness, taking trails that were barely maintained and not on any maps. Over the next 3 days, Emma slowly came back to herself. Her body warmed up completely. The color returned to her skin. Her strength began to return in small increments. Jake fed her broth and bread and tea, and she ate like someone who had forgotten what food tasted like. He asked her questions gently, not pushing too hard, trying to give her space to trust him while also trying to understand her story. She didn't offer much. Yes, she was from back east. No, she didn't want to talk about why she was out here. No, there was nobody who needed to know where she was. Yes, she was grateful for his help. No, she didn't want to cause him any trouble. Jake recognized the pattern. It was the pattern of someone who was running from something. Someone who had reasons not to be found. He had met people like that before, people who came up to the mountains looking for a place where they could disappear, where nobody asked questions and everybody minded their own business. He had always been willing to let them be. It wasn't his nature to pry, and it wasn't his place to judge. If someone was out here, they had their reasons. That was all that mattered. On the 4th day, Emma was strong enough to move around the cabin. Jake helped her walk from the bed to the chair by the fire, supporting her weight as she moved slowly, carefully, testing her recovering muscles. It took her 20 minutes to make the journey of 20 feet. By the time she reached the chair, she was breathing hard and shaking with effort. But she had made it. She sat there and looked around the cabin properly for the first time. Jake watched her take in the details. The rough-hewn walls, the simple furniture, the stove and the supplies, the pictures on the walls, the few personal touches that indicated someone actually lived here. "I don't have much," Jake said. "This is a working cabin, not a home. I'm up here most of the year tending cattle. I come down to town maybe once a month for supplies. It's a solitary life." Emma nodded slowly. "It's nice," she said, and something in her voice suggested she meant it. "It's peaceful." Jake didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. He just made sure she had water within reach and left her there while he went about his business. There were animals to tend to. There was firewood to bring in. There were things that needed doing, blizzard or no blizzard. The mountain didn't care about his new house guest. It demanded the same things from him that it always did. On the 5th day, Emma asked if she could take a bath. Jake set up the tin tub in front of the fire and heated water on the stove until it was warm enough, then carried it in buckets and poured it into the tub. He gave her privacy, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. When she emerged 45 minutes later, she looked transformed. The dirt was gone. Her hair was clean and hung down past her shoulders, darker than it had appeared when frozen and mud-covered. Her face was fully flushed with color for the first time since he had found her. She looked alive in a way she hadn't before. Jake had to consciously keep his expression neutral. "This is better," Emma said, and there was a small smile at the corners of her mouth. Much better. She was wearing one of Jake's clean shirts and a pair of his spare pants, both of which were too large for her but which fit well enough. Her own clothes had been washed and were hanging to dry by the fire. "Have you eaten?" Jake asked, and she nodded. "Good. You'll get your strength back faster if you keep your caloric intake up. You've used a lot of energy recovering from the cold. Your body needs fuel." Over the next few days, Emma continued to improve. She became more talkative, though she still never offered information about herself unless directly asked. Jake learned that she liked coffee more than tea, that she could cook if given the ingredients, that she read when given the opportunity, and that she seemed to have a prodigious memory, able to recall things she had read years ago. He learned that she was intelligent, observant, and careful about how much she revealed. He didn't learn why she had been out on that trail. He didn't learn what she was running from or who she was running from. There was a haunted quality to her, something in her eyes that suggested she had seen things that were difficult to unsee, experienced things that had fundamentally altered her understanding of the world. Jake recognized that quality because he had seen it in the mirror before. The mountains had a way of doing that to people. They stripped away the comfortable fictions that other places allowed you to maintain. They showed you the raw truth of existence, and once you had seen that truth, it was hard to unsee it. On the 10th day after he had found her, the weather cleared enough that the roads became passable. Jake would have been able to ride down to town if he needed to, could have gotten help if he needed to get help. The isolation that had seemed absolute just days before was suddenly optional. Emma understood this. Jake could see it in the way her whole demeanor changed when she realized she could leave. She became more guarded again, more careful, more distant. The easy conversations they had been having stopped. She spent more time looking out the windows. She asked him careful questions about what was down the mountain, what town was like, who lived there, what the roads were like. Jake answered her questions, but he also watched her carefully. He was beginning to understand that this woman was wanted by someone, that she had run from something serious enough to risk her life in a blizzard. He was beginning to suspect that sending her back down the mountain might be a mistake. But it wasn't his choice to make. She was well enough to leave. If she wanted to go, he would help her go. It was her life, her decisions, her risks to take or not take. On the morning of the 11th day, Emma said she wanted to go. Jake didn't argue. He helped her gather the few things she had, cleaned up her borrowed clothes, prepared her the best supplies he could to help her through the journey. The horse that had brought her here had recovered from the ordeal. It was saddled and ready. Emma stood on the porch of the cabin looking down at the mountain spreading out below her. The sun was shining. The sky was clear. The worst of the snow had already begun to melt. The world down there was calling to her. "I won't forget what you did," Emma said, "saving my life, giving me shelter, not asking questions when you probably had them. I owe you a debt." "You don't owe me anything," Jake said, and he meant it. "You were in trouble. I helped, that's all." But she shook her head. "That's not how it works. People who help you when you're at your most vulnerable, people who don't demand explanations or conditions in return, those people matter. They change things. I will remember you. I will remember this mountain. I will remember what kindness looks like." Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he just helped her mount the horse and stood back. Emma looked down at him from the saddle, and for a moment something passed between them. An understanding, maybe. A recognition of something shared. Then she turned the horse toward the trail down and began the journey back to the rest of the world. Jake watched her go until she disappeared around a bend, swallowed up by the trees and the distance. Then he went back inside the cabin and tried to resume his life as it had been before. He tried, but it wasn't the same. The cabin felt different. The mountains felt different. Everything felt like it was missing something now, and Jake couldn't quite figure out what. 2 weeks later, Jake rode down to town for supplies. He went to the general store like he always did, bought the things he needed, exchanged small talk with the proprietor. It was the same as always, except it wasn't the same at all because Jake found himself asking questions he wouldn't normally ask. "Do you remember a woman coming through here recently? Tall, dark hair, dressed in fancy clothes." The store owner scratched his chin and thought about it. "There was a woman came through about a week back, asking for supplies. She had a horse and enough money to buy what she needed. Seemed like she was just passing through. Don't think she said where she was going or where she came from. Did she seem like she was in trouble?" The owner laughed. "Everyone who comes up here seems like they're in trouble. That's half the reason they come up here. Out of the ordinary trouble." The owner went quiet. "Actually, now that you mention it, there was something." She looked scared. Not of anything immediate, but scared of something far away, scared of being followed, kept looking over her shoulder. Jake nodded slowly and paid for his supplies and left. He didn't know what to do with this information. He didn't know if it changed anything. Emma had wanted to go, and he had let her go. Whatever trouble she was running from, it wasn't his trouble anymore. Except he couldn't stop thinking about her. Couldn't stop wondering if she had made it safely to wherever it was she was trying to go. Couldn't stop wondering if she was in danger. Couldn't stop wondering if there was more he should have done. The weeks turned into months. Winter came fully to the mountains, bringing snow and ice and temperatures so cold that the world seemed to freeze solid. Jake worked the cattle. He maintained the cabin. He lived his solitary life in the way he always had, but something in him had changed. He was more aware now of what it felt like to not be alone, more aware of what companionship could offer, more aware of what he had been missing by choosing to live this far away from everything. One afternoon in early December, Jake was working in the barn when the sound of a horse reached his ears. It was unusual. Nobody came up here in winter. The road became impassable. The weather was too dangerous. Whoever was coming had gone to significant effort to get here. Jake stepped out of the barn and shaded his eyes against the glare off the snow. A horse was coming up the trail, and on that horse was a person. Jake's heart began beating faster. He knew that figure. He knew that horse. It was Emma, but she wasn't alone. There were two men with her. Men in expensive suits despite the cold. Men who sat in their saddles like they were used to power and authority. Men who were looking at Jake's cabin with the intensity of people who had been hunting for something for a very long time. Emma rode straight to the cabin and dismounted, moving toward Jake with clear intention. The two men started to follow her, but she held up a hand. "Wait here," she said, and something in her voice made them stop. They didn't look happy about it, but they stopped. Emma reached Jake, and her face was different than it had been before. No longer haunted, no longer running, more certain, more present. "I came back," she said simply. "I needed to come back." "You can't stay up here," Jake said, looking past her at the two men. "Those men, whoever they are, they're looking for something. If you're running," Jake shook his head, cutting him off. "I'm not running anymore. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Everything's changed. I wanted to explain to you, wanted to tell you what happened after I left. That's why I'm here." Emma gestured for him to come with her, and despite his better judgment, Jake did. They walked together toward the cabin, away from the two men who were watching them with expressions of professional patience. "I was in trouble when you found me," Emma began. "Real trouble. I was running from someone. A man who wanted to control me, who had controlled me, who I had to get away from." She paused at the doorway of the cabin. "That's all I'll say about that. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I got away. I made it to somewhere safe. I had people who helped me figure things out. And I realized something while I was recovering, something I realized I needed to do." Jake waited, sensing she wasn't finished. "I needed to come back here. I needed to see you again. I needed to make sure that what I remembered about this place, about you, about what kindness looked like was real. Because if it was real, if there really were people in the world willing to help without expecting something in return, then maybe there was hope for me. Maybe there was hope for the world. Emma's eyes were bright, not with fear now, but with something else. Determination, maybe, or purpose, maybe both. And when I came back, I realized something else. I realized that I was safe now. That the threat was gone. That I could make choices that weren't born from desperation. That I could choose what I wanted instead of just running from what I didn't want. Jake still didn't understand completely, but he was beginning to understand enough. "You want to stay," he said carefully. "I want to stay," Emma confirmed. "If you'll have me, if you can look past what I am and who I was and just see me." Emma Morrison, not the running woman, not the scared girl, just me. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she had arrived. He saw someone who had been through something terrible and had survived it. Someone who had chosen to come back to the one place where she had felt safe. Someone who was offering him something he hadn't even known he wanted. A chance at something other than solitude. A chance at partnership. A chance at building something that wasn't just about survival. The two men with her, Jake asked, gesturing toward them. "Protection," Emma said. "Friends. People who helped me escape. They're going to continue helping me, helping us if you want that. Helping us build something safe here. Something that can't be taken away." Jake nodded slowly. "This is where I need to be," Emma said. "This is where I want to be. Not because I'm running anymore, but because this is where I choose to be, with you, in the mountains. Where nobody asks questions and everybody minds their own business. Where I can be myself." "I would like that," Jake said quietly. "I would like that very much." Emma smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had come through darkness and found light on the other side. The smile of someone who had been lost and had found her way home. The smile of someone who was finally, truly safe. The two men eventually rode back down the mountain. Emma stayed. She and Jake married in the small town church just after the new year, with just a few witnesses and with no explanation offered about who she was or where she had come from. The townspeople didn't ask many questions. That was the way of mountain communities. You took people as they were in the present. You didn't demand to know their pasts. Emma and Jake worked the ranch together. They built something stable and real and good. Emma proved to be every bit as capable as any man when it came to ranch work. She was strong and smart and determined. And she was kind. The kind of kindness that came from understanding what it felt like to be at the very edge of survival, to be helped by someone who didn't have to help. She brought that kindness to everything she did. Jake eventually understood, piece by piece, through conversations that happened slowly over months and years, that Emma had been something before she came to the mountain. Something important. Someone of significance. The details remained vague, but Jake understood that she had been trapped in a situation that had required her escape, that she had been running for her life, that the men who had come to the mountain had been part of her rescue, that she had been given a choice about what to do with her freedom, and she had chosen Jake. She had chosen the mountains. She had chosen a life of simplicity and solitude and genuine connection. She had chosen to be Emma Morrison, not whoever she had been before. And Jake accepted that, never pushing for more information, never demanding to know the complete truth. Because he understood something fundamental that the world sometimes forgets. Sometimes the past doesn't matter as much as the future. Sometimes where someone came from is less important than where they're choosing to go. Sometimes the kindness you show someone in their darkest moment creates a bond that no explanation can fully capture or define. Jake and Emma lived on that mountain for the rest of their lives, building something real and lasting, something that meant something, something that spoke to the fundamental human need for connection and safety and home. The blizzard that had brought them together that winter's day became the pivotal moment of both their lives, the moment that changed everything, the moment that showed them both what they had been missing, the moment that taught them both that sometimes, when you find someone who needs saving and you save them without condition or expectation, You might be saving yourself at the same time. And that's a kind of grace that doesn't come around very often. That's a kind of transformation that stays with you for the rest of your life. Jake never quite lost the sense of wonder that had filled him when Emma came riding back up that mountain in December. The sense that life could surprise you, that goodness still existed in the world, that sometimes the person you rescue ends up being the one who rescues you in return. It just happens in ways you don't expect, in ways that remake your entire understanding of what it means to be alive, to be connected, to be truly home. Years passed on that mountain, and with each passing season came layers of understanding that Jake and Emma never explicitly discussed, but both felt in their bones. The ranch became known throughout the region not for its size or its profitability, but for something harder to quantify, a sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the land itself. People would come to work there, drawn by word of mouth, and they'd stay longer than they intended. Some stayed for years. There was something about the way Jake and Emma ran things, the respect they showed for every person who walked through their gate, the way they seemed to understand struggle without needing explanations. One particular autumn, nearly a decade after Emma had appeared in that blizzard, a man arrived at the ranch asking for work. He was older, weathered, with the kind of face that had seen things he'd rather forget. Jake almost turned him away. Something about his demeanor triggered caution, but Emma stopped him with a look. She spoke to the man privately for nearly an hour while Jake watched from a distance, uncertain and slightly protective. When the conversation ended, Emma nodded once and Jake hired him. The man's name was Charles, and he never offered his last name. He worked with quiet competence and asked for nothing but the basics: food, a place to sleep, honest wages. But what struck Jake most was the way Emma and Charles sometimes exchanged glances, glances loaded with recognition and something that might have been shared sorrow. It took Jake months to understand that Charles had been part of the network that had rescued Emma, that he had known her in her previous life, that his presence on the ranch was both a comfort to Emma and a reminder of everything she had left behind. One evening, as Jake and Charles sat on the porch after a long day's work, the older man finally spoke about things that had remained unspoken since his arrival. Not everything, never everything, but enough. "She was one of the strongest women I ever knew," Charles said, his voice quiet against the mountain wind. "Before, she had everything mapped out, a plan, a future, all the trappings of success. And she gave it all up." "Why?" Jake asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. "Because it wasn't real," Charles said simply. "Because the price was too high. Because she understood something that took the rest of us years to learn. That survival isn't the same as living. That you can have everything and still be imprisoned. That sometimes the only way to be free is to lose everything and start over." But Charles didn't stay at the ranch indefinitely. After 3 seasons, he told Jake and Emma that he needed to move on. He had family matters to attend to, unfinished business in the world below the mountains. The night before he left, the 3 of them sat together without speaking for a long time. There were no lengthy goodbyes, no promises to stay in touch. They all understood that this was how it would be. Charles had served his purpose in their lives, a bridge between Emma's past and her present, a validation that her choice had been witnessed and understood by someone who had known both versions of her. After he left, Emma seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't acknowledged carrying had finally been set down. She and Jake began to talk more openly about the ranch's future, about the possibility of bringing in help beyond temporary workers, about creating something that could outlast them both. It was during one of these conversations, sitting on the porch overlooking the valley below as snow began to fall in late October, that Emma revealed she was pregnant. Jake remembered the shock, the joy, the terror. They were no longer young, and Emma had never mentioned wanting children. Yet here they were, about to become parents, about to create life in this isolated mountain sanctuary that had already saved one life and transformed another. The pregnancy progressed slowly and naturally, and Emma continued to work right up until the final weeks, as stubborn and capable as she had always been. Jake found himself becoming increasingly protective, much to her amusement. The local doctor, who had come to know them both over the years, made careful arrangements to be on call for the delivery. The nearest hospital was hours away, but both Emma and the doctor seemed confident in their ability to handle the birth at home, surrounded by the land that had already become so much a part of their story. When labor began in early spring, during a mild evening when the snow had finally started to melt, and the promise of new growth was evident in every budding tree, Jake's world narrowed to a single focus: the woman who had saved him as surely as he had once saved her. The doctor arrived within 2 hours, and for the next 6 hours, the ranch house became a space transformed by the ancient mystery of birth. Jake held Emma's hand through contractions, whispered encouragement, marveled at the strength that seemed to flow through her from some bottomless well of determination. Their daughter arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep crimson. She was small but robust, with a set of lungs that announced her arrival with fury and purpose. Emma held her, tears streaming down her face, and looked at Jake with an expression he had never quite seen before, vulnerable and triumphant at the same time, broken open and made whole. They named her Sophie after Emma's grandmother, a name that seemed to bridge both the life Emma had left behind and the life she had chosen. From the first moment, Sophie seemed to embody both of her parents, Jake's quiet strength and Emma's kind intelligence. The ranch transformed again, becoming a place shaped by the presence of a child, by the daily rituals of parenting, by the way that new life seemed to renew everything around it. But something else shifted too, something that neither Jake nor Emma had anticipated. As Sophie grew and as word spread through the small communities that dotted the mountains and valleys, people began to arrive asking for them by name. Not for work, for other reasons. They came looking for Emma specifically, and while most were turned away at the gate, Emma herself made the decision to meet with certain visitors. Jake didn't fully understand it at first, but he began to realize that Emma had become something of a legend in the network of people who helped those in desperate situations. Her story, or rather, the aspects of her story that had been shared and filtered and transformed through the grapevine, had taken on a kind of mythic quality. She was the woman who had escaped. She was the woman who had disappeared and survived. She was proof that it was possible to reclaim your life, to start completely over, to find genuine happiness and connection on the other side of trauma. One spring afternoon, when Sophie was about 4 years old, a young woman arrived at the ranch gates in a state of desperate urgency. She was frightened, clearly running from something, with the kind of fear in her eyes that Jake recognized because he had seen it before, worn by Emma when she first arrived. Emma went out to meet her, and Jake watched from a distance as the two women spoke. Later that evening, Emma asked Jake if they could offer the woman shelter for a few days while she got in contact with people who could help her move forward. Jake recognized the significance of this moment. His wife was choosing to extend to someone else the same grace that had been extended to her. She was becoming part of the network, part of the system of care and rescue that had once saved her life. It was something that could have angered him, the thought of danger coming to their door, the possibility that Emma's past could intrude on their present. But instead he found himself saying yes before he had fully thought through his answer. The young woman, who introduced herself only as Sarah, stayed at the ranch for 2 weeks. During that time, Emma worked with her on documentation, on connecting her with people who could help facilitate her escape from whatever situation she had been running from. Sophie, not yet understanding the full weight of what was happening, simply saw another adult who needed kindness, and she offered it with the thoughtless generosity of children. When Sarah finally left the ranch, traveling with one of Charles's contacts who had come to pick her up, she embraced Emma with tears in her eyes and thanked her with a gratitude that went beyond words. Emma held her and promised that she would be okay, that the worst was behind her, that there were good people in the world who would help her rebuild. After Sarah had gone, Jake found Emma sitting alone on the porch, watching the sun set over the distant peaks. He sat beside her without speaking, understanding that she was processing something larger than just one woman's escape. "I never thought I'd be in a position to help someone else," Emma said eventually. "I spent so long just trying to help myself, just trying to survive the next day. And now I have a daughter who will never know that kind of fear. She'll grow up safe and strong, and she'll never understand what it means to be trapped. And that's what I want for her. But it also means I have a responsibility to use what I've learned to help other people find their way out." "You could have said no to Sarah," Jake pointed out gently. "You could have protected our life, our privacy, our safety." "I could have," Emma agreed, "and I thought about it. But then I remembered the moment you found me in that blizzard. You didn't have to help me. You could have ridden past, left me to die in the snow, gone about your life. But you didn't. You made a choice that changed both of our lives. I need to make that choice too for other people. It's not just about gratitude. It's about understanding that rescue is a kind of power, and power has a responsibility attached to it." Over the next several years, the ranch quietly became a station on an underground network of safe houses. Nothing was ever openly acknowledged. There were no signs, no formal organization, no official connection to anything. But Emma and Jake worked carefully with people they could trust: social workers, law enforcement officers who had grown tired of the system's inadequacy, volunteers who had dedicated their lives to helping those who couldn't help themselves. Jake found himself becoming more involved than he had initially anticipated. Sophie grew up surrounded by the knowledge that the ranch was not just a place of refuge for animals and for work, but a place of refuge for people. She learned early that some visitors needed protection, that some stories were too painful to ask about, that kindness sometimes meant keeping quiet about what you observed. It was during Sophie's 8th year that something unexpected happened, something that would force Jake and Emma to confront aspects of Emma's past that they had never fully explored. A man arrived at the ranch requesting an audience with Emma. He wasn't frightened or desperate. He was wealthy, well-dressed, and carried himself with the kind of assured confidence that came from money and power. Emma's face went pale when she saw him, and Jake moved instinctively to protect her, placing himself between them. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "My name is Richard Ashford. I am Emma's former fiancé." The words hung in the air like an explosion, forcing Jake to reconsider everything he thought he understood about his wife's history. Emma had mentioned a situation she had escaped, a network of people involved in her rescue, but she had never mentioned love, commitment, or an abandoned fiancé. "Please," Richard continued, "I just need to talk to her. Just for a few minutes. I've been looking for her for 10 years. I need to know she's safe. I need to know she's happy." Jake looked at Emma, whose face was an unreadable mask of emotion. After a long moment she nodded once, a permission that was fragile and uncertain. "In the cabin," she said quietly, "away from the house, away from Sophie." Jake wanted to protest, wanted to demand answers, wanted to protect his wife from whatever this moment meant. But he recognized that this was Emma's choice to make, her past that needed to be faced. So he watched as his wife walked away with another man, carrying secrets and histories that even marriage hadn't fully resolved. They were gone for nearly 3 hours. When Emma returned, her eyes were red from crying, and there was something different in her expression, a kind of resolved sadness, an understanding that had come too late to change anything but somehow still mattered. Richard left the ranch that afternoon without speaking to Jake, without explanation, carrying whatever closure he had found or failed to find back down the mountain. That night, as they lay in bed, Emma finally told him. Richard had been a good man, genuinely good, and she had loved him. They had been planning a life together, or at least the life that their families and their circumstances had planned for them. But his family had been connected, not directly, but through business interests and old money connections, to the situation she had escaped. Not perpetrators, but complicit in their ignorance or their willful blindness. When Emma realized the depth of those connections, she understood that staying with Richard would mean returning to a world that allowed such things to flourish. She would have become part of the machinery, another person who turned away and accepted explanations. He understood eventually, Emma said. Or at least he said he understood. He offered to walk away from his family, to renounce his inheritance, to build a completely different life with me. But I think we both knew that wouldn't work. That too much of who he was depended on where he came from, and I needed to be someone completely new. I couldn't build that new life with someone whose roots went so deep into the old world. Do you regret it? Jake asked quietly. Sometimes, Emma admitted. I regret the pain I caused him. I regret that I couldn't find a way to make both things work. But no, I don't regret choosing this. Choosing you, choosing to be here. Because this is real in a way that life would never have been. This is built on something true. Jake held her through the night, understanding that Emma's past would never be fully resolved, that there would always be ghosts walking through their lives, people she had loved and lost, people she had saved and who had moved on, people whose lives had intersected briefly with hers and been transformed by that intersection. And that was okay. That was part of the price of being human, of being connected to others, of allowing your life to be shaped by moments and choices that came from circumstances beyond your control. Sophie grew up knowing her mother only as Emma, but understanding in the way that children understand such things, that there was depth and complexity to her story. She learned to ask questions carefully, to honor silences when silence was required, to understand that adults carried pain in ways that weren't always visible. And as she became a teenager, she began to understand something more, that her mother's choice to help others, to be part of this network, to sacrifice parts of her own peace for the sake of strangers, was a form of healing. One evening, when Sophie was 17 and had begun to ask more direct questions about her mother's past, Emma took her to a specific spot on the mountain, the place where Jake had found her that winter day, nearly 2 decades earlier. They sat together looking out over the valley, and Emma told her daughter for the first time the full story. She told her about the situation she had fled, the people involved, the scope of what she had been trapped in. She told her about the moment of escape, the men who had risked themselves to help her, the network that had hidden her and protected her. She told her about the blizzard and about Jake, about the moment she decided that she would stay, that she would build a new life, that she would honor her freedom by choosing connection and vulnerability over safety and isolation. And then she told her about Richard, about the love that wasn't enough, about the impossibility of bridging 2 worlds. She told her about Sarah and about the other women they had helped over the years. She told her about the choice to use her own trauma and her own escape as a way to help others find their way out of similar situations. You're asking yourself if this is something you want to be part of, Emma said, not as a question, but as a statement. You're asking yourself if this is your responsibility because it's your mother's, and I need you to know that it isn't. You're not obligated to carry my past or my choices. You have the freedom to build something entirely different if you want to. Sophie was quiet for a long time before responding. But that's not what I want, she said finally. Watching you all these years, seeing the people you've helped, understanding what you've sacrificed, I don't see it as a burden. I see it as a calling. I want to do this, not because I have to, but because I want to. Emma held her daughter, tears streaming down her face, and in that moment, something shifted in the family's narrative. The rescue that had begun in a blizzard was being passed forward, being multiplied, being transformed into something larger than any one person's story. Sophie would become the next generation of this work, carrying it forward with her own intelligence and her own moral clarity, shaping it into new forms that reflected her generation's understanding of justice and compassion. The ranch itself became known among certain circles not just as a place of refuge, but as a place of training. Young people who wanted to be part of this work came to learn from Emma and Jake, to understand the psychology of trauma and recovery, to develop the skills necessary to help others without causing further harm. The operation remained small and careful, always mindful of the dangers involved, always cautious about who was admitted to the network. But something was changing in the broader world too. The internet had become ubiquitous, and with it came new dangers but also new possibilities for connection and coordination. Social movements were beginning to organize in ways that had never been possible before, bringing visibility to issues that had long remained hidden. Emma found herself increasingly connected to larger networks of activists and advocates, using her own story, carefully, always protecting her current privacy and safety, to help other women understand that escape was possible, that recovery was possible, that rebuilding was possible. It was during this period of expansion that something entirely unexpected occurred. A documentary filmmaker who had been researching stories of human trafficking and rescue networks became aware of Emma's story. Not through any direct revelation by Emma herself, but through the network of people whose lives she had touched, whose freedom she had facilitated. The filmmaker reached out, requesting an interview, offering anonymity and protection, asking if Emma would be willing to share her story for a film that could raise awareness about the scope of the problem. Emma was uncertain. Jake was opposed, but Sophie encouraged her mother to consider it, to think about the potential impact, to recognize that hiding had been the right choice for a long time, but that perhaps there was now a moment where telling the truth could do more good than concealment could. After weeks of careful deliberation and consultation with security experts and trauma specialists, Emma agreed to participate in the documentary, though with significant protections. Her face was not shown, but her voice was heard. Her words were given weight and authenticity. She spoke about her experience without graphic detail, focusing instead on the moment of rescue, the process of recovery, the reality of rebuilding an identity after it had been shattered. The documentary premiered at a film festival that spring, generating significant attention. Media outlets picked up the story, though Emma's identity remained protected. The impact rippled outward in ways that none of them could have predicted. Women who had been trapped in similar situations reached out to the network, seeking help. Other people involved in rescue and recovery work came forward, building alliances and sharing resources. The work became more visible, more organized, more effective. But with increased visibility came increased scrutiny. There were people who didn't want these stories told, who had invested interests in keeping such situations hidden and unaddressed. There were threats, vague and direct, ominous in their implications. Jake, for the first time since Emma had arrived in the blizzard, became genuinely frightened for their safety. It was Charles who returned during this period of tension, arriving unannounced at the ranch with the same quiet competence he had always carried. He didn't speak about why he had come or what had alerted him to the danger, but his presence was a signal to Jake and Emma that their previous life of relative isolation was truly over, that they had stepped into a larger arena with larger dangers. "We need to secure the property," Charles said, speaking to them in matter-of-fact terms. "We need better security systems, better communication protocols, and we need to expand the network in a way that distributes the risk. You're too much of a focal point right now. You need allies." Over the following months, the ranch transformed yet again, becoming not just a refuge but a regional hub in a larger network of safe houses and support services. Other properties were established in nearby areas, creating redundancy and distributed security. Training programs expanded, becoming more formalized and systematic. Emma and Jake began to travel more, speaking at conferences and workshops, connecting with other organizations doing similar work. It was exhausting and exhilarating at the same time. Jake found himself becoming more public than he had ever anticipated. his quiet nature tested by the necessity of advocacy and education. But Emma thrived in this expanded role, finally finding a way to transform her trauma into something that could help others on a larger scale than she had previously imagined possible. Sophie, now in her early 20s, became fully involved in the work, taking charge of the ranch operations while her parents traveled. She had inherited both of her parents' qualities: her mother's emotional intelligence and understanding of trauma, her father's practical competence and quiet strength. She managed the property with a combination of firmness and gentleness, creating an environment where people could heal while also maintaining the security protocols necessary to keep everyone safe. One autumn evening, more than 20 years after that original blizzard, Jake and Emma stood together on the same spot where Emma had first emerged from the snow. The ranch had grown beyond anything they had imagined. There were multiple buildings now, gardens that sustained the property throughout the seasons, a small school that Sophie ran for children whose families were in transition. The operation had become sophisticated, well-organized, integrated into a broader movement of survivors and advocates working toward systemic change. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked Jake, echoing a question he had once asked her. "Do you ever wish we had just stayed isolated here, that we had kept our peace and our privacy?" Jake considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "When I see the cost, when I understand what we've risked, when I think about how complicated our lives have become. But then I remember that first moment, finding you in the snow, making the choice to help you. And I understand that choosing to help someone always complicates things. Connection always complicates things. But that complication is worth it, because it's the complication of meaning and purpose and impact." He paused, looking out at the ranch that had become so much more than a place to raise animals and grow food. "We saved each other," he continued. "Not just in that blizzard, but over and over again, in all the ways that matter. You saved me from a life of isolation and meaninglessness. I saved you from a blizzard, but you saved yourself. And in saving yourself, you became someone who could help save others. That's not something I regret. That's something I'm grateful for every single day." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in the gathering darkness, watching lights come on in the ranch buildings, understanding that somewhere within those buildings were people who were finding their way back to themselves, who were discovering that survival was possible, that recovery was possible, that a new life could be built from the ashes of an old one that had been shattered beyond recognition. The story of the mountain cowboy and the injured woman in the snowstorm had grown into something none of them could have predicted, a testament to the power of rescue, the possibility of transformation, and the reality that sometimes the person you save becomes the one who saves you. But what Jake and Emma didn't know, what none of them could have possibly anticipated, was that this story was far from over. The threads of fate that had woven them together that night in the blizzard were still pulling, still connecting people and events in ways that would take years to fully unravel. 6 months after that autumn evening, a letter arrived at the ranch. It came through official channels, forwarded by 3 different attorneys, bearing the seal of a prestigious law firm based in Denver. Jake found it in the mailbox at the end of the long drive, and something about the weight of it in his hands made him pause. He carried it inside without opening it, sensing somehow that whatever was contained in those pages would change things again. Emma was in the kitchen when he walked in, preparing lunch for the 37 people currently staying at the ranch. She looked up, and her face immediately registered the shift in his expression. She knew him well enough to read the subtle language of his body, the slight tension in his shoulders that meant something significant had arrived. "What is it?" she asked, setting down the knife she'd been using to slice vegetables. Jake handed her the envelope without speaking. Emma wiped her hands on a towel and opened it carefully, her eyes moving across the pages with increasing speed, then slowing down, then moving back up to reread something she'd clearly misunderstood the first time. "This can't be real," she whispered. "What?" Jake moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The letter explained that Emma's mother, her biological mother, the woman who had given her up for adoption when Emma was an infant, had passed away. She had been a wealthy woman, the owner of a significant art collection and real estate holdings spread across 3 states. She had died without ever having married again, without having had other children, and she had never changed her will. In it, she had named Emma as her sole beneficiary, with the caveat that Emma could only inherit if she could be located and identified. It had taken 23 years. Private investigators, genealogical records, DNA databases, and finally a cold case researcher who had become interested in Emma's disappearance when she was 4 years old, had led them to this moment. The inheritance was substantial, nearly $8 million, along with properties in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. Why didn't she come find me? Emma's voice was small, caught somewhere between grief for a woman she'd never known and anger at all the years of abandonment. Jake didn't have an answer. He simply put his arm around her and held her while she processed the shock of being suddenly connected to a past she'd thought was forever sealed off. Sophie found them like that an hour later, still standing in the kitchen, the letter now sitting on the counter. She was 23 years old now, capable and assured, someone who had grown up seeing her parents navigate impossible situations with grace and intelligence. She read the letter once, and then she looked at her mother with an expression that was more pragmatic than emotional. "What are you going to do?" she asked. It was the right question. Emma looked at Jake, and they both understood that they were at another crossroads. Money of that magnitude changed things. It created options and opportunities, but it also created complications and choices that could spiral outward in unexpected directions. "We need to visit the properties," Emma said slowly. "We need to understand what she left behind, not just the financial aspects, but who she was, why she made the choices she did." Over the next 3 months, Jake and Emma made trips to each of the properties. The first was a beautiful estate in Boulder, Colorado, a house with 12 rooms, large windows overlooking the Flatirons, gardens that had been meticulously maintained by a hired staff even after Emma's mother's death. Walking through those rooms felt like stepping into someone else's life, a life so different from anything Emma had experienced that it seemed to belong to an entirely different person. The second property was more surprising. It was a small cabin in northern New Mexico, positioned on land that overlooked a vast desert landscape. The cabin was modest, almost humble, decorated with southwestern art and filled with books. Here Emma found journals, her mother's journals stacked on shelves, documenting decades of thoughts, feelings, regrets, and observations about the life she'd lived. Emma spent an entire week in that cabin, reading her mother's words. She discovered that her mother had wanted to find her many times over the years, but had been prevented by adoption laws that sealed records, by the shame and fear she carried about the circumstances of Emma's conception. A brief relationship with a man who had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with either of them. She found passages where her mother had written about the guilt of giving up her child, about the hope that maybe, somehow, Emma had ended up in a good home with people who loved her. The third property was an apartment in Santa Fe, sparsely furnished, more of a pied-à-terre than a home, and it was here, in a locked drawer in a desk, that Emma found the real secret. There were photographs, dozens of them. Photographs of Emma herself, spanning the entire arc of her visible life. School pictures that had been published in local newspapers. Images of her at competitions, from articles in regional magazines about young achievers. Photographs printed from news coverage of the search efforts after she disappeared. Her mother had been watching, following, collecting information about her daughter from a distance, unable to claim her, but unable to stop caring about her. And there were letters, unsent letters, addressed to "my daughter," but never mailed, never delivered. Emma read them by the window of the Santa Fe apartment, tears streaming down her face, understanding finally that her mother had loved her, had never stopped loving her, had simply been bound by circumstances and systems that prevented her from acting on that love in any way that mattered. When Emma returned to the ranch, she made a decision. She and Jake would use the inheritance to formally expand the operation. They would establish an endowment that would ensure the ranch could function for decades to come, not dependent on their personal resources or energy. They would create scholarships for young people from traumatic backgrounds who wanted to go to college. They would fund research into the long-term effects of trauma and the most effective intervention strategies. But they would also do something else. Emma established a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping adoptees and biological parents navigate the complex landscape of reunion and reconnection. She funded legal efforts to unseal adoption records in states where they remained closed. She created a database that could help people find each other, erasing some of the barriers that had prevented her own mother from reaching out. Sophie took charge of integrating these new initiatives into the ranch's existing work. She was a natural administrator, someone who could see the big picture while also attending to the thousand small details that made large operations function smoothly. She hired additional staff, developed training protocols, and began to transform the ranch from a primarily residential facility into something more comprehensive: a research center, a training facility, a gathering place for people doing similar work across the country. 2 years into these expansions, Sophie met someone who would change the trajectory of her own life. His name was Marcus, and he came to the ranch as part of a fellowship program for young people interested in trauma-informed community development. He was the son of parents who had both survived significant childhood trauma, but had managed to break the cycle with their own children. He had grown up watching his parents do healing work, and he wanted to dedicate his own life to similar efforts. Sophie initially resisted the attraction. She had witnessed firsthand how personal relationships could complicate the professional work her parents were doing. She had seen the challenges of balancing love with purpose, intimacy with mission. But Marcus was patient and thoughtful, and over the months of his fellowship, he demonstrated a depth of understanding about the work and about Sophie herself that gradually lowered her defenses. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at the ranch, they had had to make the decision to ask someone to leave because they violated the safety protocols that protected everyone else. Marcus found Sophie sitting alone on the porch of the main house, looking out at the darkening landscape. "Hard day?" he asked, sitting beside her but respecting her space. "There's a woman in there who reminded me of my mother," Sophie said. "Not physically, but in the way she carries her trauma, in the way it expresses itself as anger and suspicion. I could see the trauma, I could feel compassion for what she's experienced, but I also had to prioritize the safety of everyone else. And that's the part of this work that never gets easier, the part where compassion and boundaries have to coexist." Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. "Your mother told me something once," he said. "She was talking about the moment your father found her in the snowstorm. She said that rescue isn't always about saving someone. Sometimes it's about making a choice to engage with someone's life when you could have walked past. And sometimes that engagement leads to transformation. And sometimes it just leads to a temporary respite before someone goes back out into the snow. But the choice to engage is always sacred, even when the outcome isn't what we hoped for." Sophie turned to look at him, and in that moment, something shifted. She understood that Marcus wasn't asking her to choose between her work and her heart. He was offering to walk beside her through both. They began dating quietly, without making any formal announcement to the staff or the residents, but eventually, it became obvious to everyone at the ranch. Jake watched his daughter with Marcus with the same mix of hope and concern that every parent feels when their child finds love. The hope that she would experience connection and partnership. The concern that it might distract from or complicate the important work she was doing. It was Emma who gave Sophie permission, in a way that only a mother who had lived through similar challenges could do. Love doesn't diminish your capacity for this work, Emma told her daughter one afternoon when they were working together in the ranch's gardens. It might change the shape of it. It might require you to make different choices about time and energy and priorities. But the people who do the most meaningful work in this world are often the ones who have experienced deep love. It connects you to your own humanity in ways that make you better at seeing and honoring the humanity in others. By the time Sophie and Marcus got engaged, a quiet proposal during a hiking trip in the mountains near the ranch, the operation had grown to encompass nearly 200 acres, multiple buildings, a permanent staff of 45 people, and a resident population that fluctuated between 30 and 50 people at any given time. But growth brought new challenges. Not everyone in the surrounding community welcomed the expansion. Some of the neighboring ranchers viewed the increased traffic and activity with suspicion. There were people who questioned whether a facility like this should exist in such a remote area, whether it was appropriate to locate vulnerable people so far from urban services and support systems. More concerning were the whispered doubts about Jake and Emma themselves. As their story had become more widely known, featured in magazine articles, discussed in academic circles, referenced in training materials for social workers and therapists, some people began to wonder if the narrative was too perfect, too redemptive. There were skeptics who questioned whether Emma's recovery could really have been as complete as it appeared, whether Jake's motives could really have been as pure as he claimed. The criticism came to a head when a local journalist named David Chen decided to investigate the ranch for a major publication. He arrived without warning one afternoon, identifying himself and asking for access to interview staff and, if possible, some of the residents. Jake's first instinct was to refuse. The residents at the ranch had been through enough exposure of their private information. They came to the ranch specifically to escape the scrutiny of a world that had failed to protect them. But Emma surprised him by saying yes. "If we're going to do this work," she told Jake privately, "if we're going to ask people to trust us with their healing, we have to be willing to be transparent about who we are and what we're doing. We can't expect vulnerable people to be vulnerable with us if we're not willing to be vulnerable in return." David Chen spent 3 weeks at the ranch. He conducted interviews with staff members, reviewed documentation of the programs, observed the daily operations. He asked Emma difficult questions about her past, about the specifics of her trauma, about the recovery process. He asked Jake why he had chosen to dedicate his life to this work, what had driven him to build something so far outside the realm of conventional ranching. In the end, David Chen wrote a story that was neither entirely flattering nor entirely skeptical. He documented the genuine good being done at the ranch, the measurable positive outcomes, the transformation of lives. But he also acknowledged the complexity, the fact that no program could help everyone, that there were residents who had struggled despite the best efforts of the staff, some who had ultimately left and returned to old patterns, some whose trauma proved more intractable than others. Most importantly, he wrote about the essential humanity at the heart of the operation. He described Jake as a man who had been forced to confront his own limitations and capacity for care, who had been transformed by the choice to engage with another person's suffering. He described Emma as someone who had taken her own experience of trauma and weaponized it against the systems and structures that perpetuated harm, turning her pain into purpose with a clarity that was almost fierce. When the article was published, it had a different effect than either Jake or Emma expected. Instead of closing doors, it opened them. Other organizations began reaching out, wanting to learn about the ranch's methods. Universities asked if researchers could study the programs. Foundations began offering grant funding. People who read David Chen's article and saw themselves in some aspect of the story began calling, asking if they could stay at the ranch, if there was room for them in this place where transformation seemed possible. Sophie and Marcus got married in the spring of the year after the article was published. The wedding took place on the ranch, under a canopy of blooming apple trees, with nearly 200 guests in attendance. There were people who worked in social services from across the country. There were academic researchers and policy advocates. There were families of current and former residents. And there were the residents themselves, people in the middle of their own healing journeys who had been invited to witness Sophie's joy and to be part of the celebration. As Emma watched her daughter dance with her new husband, she thought about that first blizzard, about the moment Jake had found her in the snow. She thought about how impossible it would have seemed then to imagine that this moment would exist, this sanctuary, this community, this extended family of people bound together by shared commitment to healing and transformation. Jake stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, and they watched together as their daughter claimed her own happiness, built her own life, made her own choices about how to direct her considerable gifts and talents. Do you ever think about how different everything would be if you hadn't gotten lost that night? Jake asked quietly. Emma considered the question. Not really, she said. Because I can't imagine a version of my life where I'm not grateful for this. Even knowing what came before, even knowing the pain that led me to that moment, I can't regret the outcome. I can grieve what was lost, and I can be angry at what was done to me, but I can't regret the life that grew out of that terrible night. She paused, watching Sophie laugh at something Marcus had whispered in her ear, watching the joy on their faces. Besides, Emma continued, Sophie exists because of that blizzard. The work we do exists because of it. The hundreds of people who have found healing here, who have had their lives changed by what we've built, they exist because I got lost and you found me. How could I ever regret that? But even as they stood there celebrating, even as they allowed themselves to bask in the warmth of their daughter's happiness and the success of their life's work, neither Jake nor Emma could have anticipated the challenge that was about to arrive. It came in the form of a phone call from Sophie early one morning, her voice tight with a kind of controlled panic that Jake and